Just put it in presentation mode and you're way to go.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone. It's been really fun listening to everyone else talking. I think so many good points have already been made. I'm not sure how much more I have to add. One thing I think James pointed out, made a comparison between the U.S. election and disasters, and I think that's a fairly kind assessment of the election process here, which has been a little bit overwhelming, still dealing with that. Also have to say, I was feeling sorry for myself for having to get up so early until Sarah said what time it was there. I'm going to talk about a project which is pretty much wrapped up at this point. I did with my co-authors, and I'll show the articles here in a few minutes. A couple caveats, though. I want to say I'm not trying to represent the National Weather Service or make any representations about their policies and practices. So hopefully anything I say about that is interpreted correctly. I'm not an expert on how they're doing their impact-based warnings. So hopefully I represent that correctly, and maybe some of the people online can jump in if I make a misrepresentation. The work I'm going to talk about was funded by NOAA, largely directly by Louis Uccellini, the National Weather Service Director. And it's kind of a demonstration project or initial attempt to start to evaluate the social economic benefits of impact-based decision support systems. So if I can advance here real quickly, I'm going to say less about the actual case study than I should, partly because the people who did most of the heavy lifting, Heather Hosterman at Apt Associates, did the technical work, so I'll try to represent that appropriately. Let's start with kind of 5 quick thoughts about this. Talk about the weather information value chain. Brian and I have been talking about that for several years, actually, and I think it plays a role in all of this. I'm going to show the references that this is based on in case you're interested and want to get into the technical aspects of this analysis, and then talk about the case study. So real quickly, and this is where I want to not represent the Weather Service, but we were looking at what's called impact-based decision support services that are being supplied now by the Weather Service, which are somewhat different than impact-based warnings. This is really decision support services from the Weather Service to their core partners, as opposed to putting out warnings about the impacts. If I'm not representing that correctly, someone let me know. So it's really about assessing the socioeconomic benefits of an improved communication process from the Weather Service to their partners, which is related to the anticipated level of impacts. And obviously every country does things a little bit differently. So I think this is kind of the approach that the US is taking right now. Want to maybe, since I'm an economist, emphasize this is trying to get an endpoint of economic assessment of the benefits of IDSS. I kind of represent that as kind of the ultimate end user verification. I think there's another workshop here in a week or two with Beth Ebert and Barb Brown talking about end user verification. That I think this could really, and we've talked about this over the years as well, be a ultimate end user verification point there. And I'd also say that if there are not socioeconomic benefits, the one need to ask is this worth doing? So trying to measure the socioeconomic benefits as an endpoint is a valid way of trying to do verification of the benefits or improvements from impact-based warnings. Also, the work that I'm talking about is a case study approach. It's kind of it's better than anecdotes, but it's not something that's universal and can be generalized to the entire country, and I'll emphasize that later. I'm not going to emphasize the quantitative analysis here. You can read the papers. If you can't get the papers, feel free to email me, and I'll try to get those to you. I'm not sure if the actual report is available online, but I can probably supply that as well. Then the other thing I'm going to talk about is the value chain before I get into talking about the case studies. This comes up across the High Weather Project. I think it's an important heuristic or tool for integrating across these different aspects. It's different fundamentally from what I'm now understanding is called value chain analysis, especially in agriculture production. It's more about the process of communication. I'll keep pushing that idea and maybe participate in the workshop in a couple weeks on the value chain stuff. So before I get into the case study, this is kind of the value chain I've talked about for quite a while. It's not necessarily the best one, hasn't advanced as much as it should, but the basic point here is that there's many different actors, many different stages in the communication process, where from the hydromet service, the NMHS at the far left, to the endpoint on the far right, we really need to understand that process of information creation, communication, dissemination to get to the endpoint of the public or the socioeconomic benefits. And I think some of the other talks have shown the incredible complexity of the social systems, of the data needs, of the modeling approaches to try to get at what's happening once this forecast or once the information starts to go out the door. And I'd always say that weather forecasters think that weather forecasting is hard. Well, the social science side is much more messy and much more complex, I'd say. And our data sources are also much more varied, as I think the other speakers have talked about. From an economic point of view, I think it'd be useful to look at each of the actors in the process. Standard economic method would be to look at their objective, their resources and constraints, and that may be a way of framing the discussion about information quality and process and flow and how that changes between the creation at the Weather Service to the end users. Also want to point out the economic values are, as some of the other speakers have talked about, extremely complex, nonlinear, dynamic, and so it's ultimately the endpoint. The value of information is the ability of the end users to make use of that information. And I think we have to be able to tell the story from end to end to understand how that value or how that information's valued. So the studies I'm going to talk about briefly here, there's 2 papers published on this. Heather Hosterman, Jen Sprague, Jeffrey Atkins are my co-authors on these. Jen with the Weather Service, Jeff is a economist, also contracted with the Weather Service, Heather with App Consulting. We have the 2 articles, one in BAMS, one in Journal Emergency Management. And the real reason, part of the reason we wanted to get this into GEM is to start dialogue with the emergency managers, have them become more aware of the IDSS and get their feedback and interaction on this. Also suggest taking a look at Louis Cellini and John Tenhove have an article in BAMS more focused on the IDSS kind of within the Weather Service aspects. And Brian also showed this other, the WMO economic book that we put together. That's where the value chain model that Brian showed came out of this. Also a good resource globally for looking at the relationship between Weather Service, National Hydromet Services, and economic analysis. So the case study, again, this was supported by NOAA. I was a consultant to APT on this, worked with Heather on this. It's a case study comparison, kind of a first foray into trying to actually put some quantitative estimates on the benefit of IDSS. And I'll say a little bit about how difficult that is in a few minutes. But basically, we tried to identify the IDSS pathways. We did this specifically with respect to winter storms in New York City area. It's still very high impact, but this is a case study of compared basically 2 storms that I'll talk about. We chose 4, but really focused on the comparison between 2. There's more information in the papers on those. Then we selected sectors to try to characterize the impacts either qualitatively or quantitatively, and they were chosen not as much because of the magnitude as impacts, partly but the availability of actually information on those impacts. And then we tried to describe the value chain and illustrate the benefits, or qualitatively measure the benefits and then quantify them where we can. So the first step was trying to see where does IDSS, impact-based decision support services, fit in the model. This in a different interpretation or different representation of the value chain. In this case, we realized that IDSS kind of fits in as an extra step between the forecast and warnings and dissemination. And it really is trying to strengthen the connection between the production and output of that information to the core users or core partners, and those core partners, quite often it's emergency managers, aviation managers, local and state and federal government agencies, specific, not necessarily end users of the information, but people who can benefit from the assistance of the Weather Service in interpreting and using that information. And a lot of what we found through interviews and stuff was that this is really, and this kind of relates back to I think Sarah's comments about trust and building those relationships and trust in the information. Then we assess the damages, though, are kind of, or the benefits are basically reduced asset damage, reduced service interruptions across these sectors. We didn't really quantify the human health impacts as much, but also recognizing the emergency management lays across this. Again, this is a fairly simplified representation. I think Sarah's diagram of all the bits and pieces of her, I think, her knowledge system really drills down a lot deeper into some of this. So the other thing is conceptualizing what we're modeling here. And if you think about this Northeast snowfall impact scale from small storms up to extreme storms, what we're trying to say is if you have without IDSS, the upper line there shows the impacts of that storm increasing with the size of the storm. At some point, they're high no matter what you do. But the idea is that with IDSS, we can hopefully lower the impacts of each of those storms based on different categories. And this identifies the two storms we're comparing in the case study, the December 2010 storm and the January 2016 storm. And the papers discuss quite a bit more about what the limitations of this are. Obviously, every storm is different times, different outcomes. So again, this is a case study. It is leading on to further work, but I won't be able to say much about that right now either. So the methods, kind of a modified sector expert elicitation. We had a number of interviews with experts in transportation, energy, ground transportation, aviation, disaster risk management in the cities and the areas around New York City. Tried to find out their protocols, the economic impacts, the extent to which these impacts could be mitigated with IDSS. Then we tried to characterize and monetize the impacts in these three different areas. Some of this was basically expert opinion. Some of it we dug out the data from, say, aviation transportation information. Focused on three areas here. One was the cost of flight cancellations, both to airlines and to customers between these two events. Differences in the ground transportation recovery system. That's the railways and buses in the New York City area, which is the whole area, all 5 boroughs. And then impacts on public power outages with the two major energy suppliers in the region. It's kind of the summary table of what we found. So this is for the 3 sectors: aviation, ground transport, and energy. The impact category is what we were trying to measure or characterize. The 2 storms of December 2010, December 16, we tried to quantify that to the extent we could, and then looked at the improvements or changes in outcomes with and without IDSS, also recognizing there was a lot of other stuff that went on in terms of emergency management preparation between 2010, 2016. I mean, after the 2010 storm, there was a lot of work in even just in preparation in, say, New York City for dealing with winter storms. So this is not all fully attributable to IDSS, but we figure a significant or a reasonable portion could be attributed there. So for instance, in terms of aviation, they went from a reactive flight cancellations to proactive flight cancellations. We focus just on New York City, but that has major implications across the whole airspace of the U.S. Basically found a reduction in costs, basically cost to the airlines and inconvenience to customers, let's say $17 million between these 2 events. Ground transportation, we were able to qualitatively assess that with discussions with the transportation systems, the MTA, I think it's the MTA in New York City, basically said they went from a recovery time of 7 days to 2 days. So from having hundreds and thousands of buses and taxis and cars stuck on the roadways to banning them before the storm, they were much more quickly able to get back to a normal system. base it by 5 days, which in New York City you can imagine is a significant improvement. With the energy, my cat is saying hi as well, so just ignore the cat. Energy, the two major energy suppliers in the New York City area were able to proactively position themselves, be ready for the outages, reduce interruption costs by something like $92 million. Again, the details on how we quantified this are more in the papers in the report. Again, with the references, if you're interested in those, if you can't find them, let me know. I can send them. I'm not sure in this, hopefully not breaking a law of copyright. I think I can send them, but that's a whole nother thing. So with that, I'll keep this fairly short and say thank you. And if you have any questions, be happy to hear them. And with that, I think I stopped sharing desktop, Brian, or?
Yeah, you can stop. I think Martin can pick up from there. Getting a little feedback. Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff, for that. You covered a lot of ground there, and I think it's quite clear that it's hard to separate the activities or interests of any single task team from all the rest, because there's aspects of evaluation, of communication, obviously the input, forecasting information, or decision support aspects from the Weather Service. We have a couple questions here, and one speaks to something that we've discussed in the past, I think, and that's from Carolina Cerudo from Argentina, and she basically makes the comment that it's important to talk about how we communicate the results of these types of studies or research to government or specific stakeholders. So how do we, I guess, take the results and make an influence, or how does that influence the way we talk about them might influence how they actually can use them?
So one thought there is, so this, my study, I think all three other people can have their perspective, is that's part of the reason we wanted to get our study into the Journal of Emergency Management, was to create a dialogue with emergency managers about IDSS if they're not aware with it, how it works, what it is, what the benefits are, so that dialogue can happen. Also, from an economic point of view, I think it's worth having that data, that information for the bureaucrats or the administration or the officials to say, yeah, there is an economic benefit to doing this. That's one endpoint. Socioeconomics or economics tries to quantify the social and economic differences, but that also, it does eventually translate to well-being. So I think if we can show how that well-being is improved, that gives a good way to discuss this with the decision makers and policy makers.
That's great. I've got a second question as well from Yaimer Uring, I think, sorry if I mispronounced your name. And that's really, you basically, what perspectives other than economics perspectives would you consider to being good candidates to push alongside the economics one that you used and talked about? So I guess what other types of disciplines, I guess, in our applications?
Okay, so hi Helmer, long time no see. So I think one of the things I had to kind of skip over, I think that the value chain concept or approach is applicable to any social science. I think communication is obviously a huge part of this, that anyone could take the value chain and say, how does communication work between the different actors, different agents? How does the content of the information change from step to step? I think any social science can overlay on this as an information process, and any social science can come at this and assess it, whether it's geography, anthropology, sociology, communication. They all can add something to understanding the information creation, communication, and the decision making. I mean, decision sciences plays a role in this. I mean, Isabel's work obviously could be integrated or is a different cut on this, or this is a different cut on Isabel's work in terms of decision making. So I think any of the other social sciences could use this approach and measure this or quantify this in as different ways. So probably a lot more to say on that, but I'll leave it at that for now.
That's great. No, thanks for that. I think we're going to close the speaking session. Obviously, Jeff's the last speaker, but then we'll have a little time now for some general questions. And I gathered a couple that we didn't get to after my introduction that I think relate to all of us, or perhaps all of the speakers could comment on. And I guess in general, it was a question: is how do you how would operational forecasters, so a very specific type of practitioner, begin making the shift to impact-based forecasting? So how can they, what should they do, and how can they do that? And I guess related to that was a second question. I'll just throw them together because they're kind of related. How do we, I guess, as researchers or people who are kind of halfway between researcher and practitioner, how do we support national service development of impact-based forecast services or warning services? So throw it out to the team to respond. I'm just gonna.
So I'll jump in first here, since I'm often happy to say things I know little about. I think that one of the approaches in the U.S. is not to jump right into forecasting and talking about the impacts, but taking a smaller step from the Weather Service to their core partners, they call them, improving that connection. Are they communicating with the emergency managers appropriately? One of the things they've started to do is operationally put weather forecasters in the emergency management operations center, so that they can improve that link from the Weather Service information to the emergency management. And it's not just emergency managers, the whole operations center, to interpret and understand information. And it's a two-way flow that the EMs can then ask the embedded forecasters for specific information or how to interpret that information. So it's a two-way flow that they can improve that communication. That's true whether it's emergency managers, the energy companies, the aviation administration people. So that's a first step, is just improving that communication operationally. I think that's what the focus, if I represent that correctly, in the US is with IDSS.
Any others want to talk about their perspectives on that?
I'll share from the New Zealand perspective, even though I'm very much an outsider as a Canadian here, but from what I can see, along the lines of what Jeff was saying, opening up communication between the different stakeholders and agencies. So in New Zealand, like I said, there's a lot of the informal partnerships that's already happening, but also taking baby steps. So the New Zealand Met Service, kind of similar to, New Zealand and Canada are quite similar in that we're very risk-averse countries. So the New Zealand Met Service is kind of hesitant to fully jump into the impact-based warning space. So they're working with my main supervisor, Dr. Sally Potter, who many of you probably know, to really explore the effectiveness of impact-based warning to see if all of this effort is actually worth it. So I think working in partnership with researchers is really critical. Researchers and meteorologists is critical. I lost my train of thought.
No, that's good. That's good. I'm just going to, before I go to Isabel and James for some feedback, I just raise a point made by Bob Goldhammer, just saying that sometimes you have to grease the wheels before you can push the information out. So he suggests that it's be nice to find a much better way to get the information into the newspapers, or I guess conventional media or social media, so that they have a better understanding of what's coming and how the actions could proceed if you take advantage of this information that's being provided. And that a little preparedness goes a long way, I guess, is the essence of his point. Isabel, James, do you want to follow up? Any comment?
Yeah, so from my perspective, there's obviously so many different players involved. So you've got your governments, you've got your insurance agencies, you've got citizen scientists, and then you've got other companies as well. And then you've got the media on top of that. So there's 5 sort of key groups in the post-disaster setting, or even in the pre-disaster setting. And the problem is that they all have different sort of ways that they want to get out the information. They also have very different ways that they approach the problem, and they also have completely different definitions as well. And so within that government, you've got then different structures depending on which country you are in the world. So in some countries, you've got 4 levels of disaster risk management agencies. So you go down from national to provincial to municipal and then to one below. And all of them sometimes have functioning disaster managers at each level of that. And then you have some countries where you've only got a national level agency. Then sometimes you've got competing agencies within that government. And then from those other 4 groups that I also talked about, there's always these competing interests even within those groups. Then you're trying to mix it all together. So I haven't seen a country yet which has successfully brought all of these 5 groups together yet. And I know there's a lot of research going out into the insurance industry versus governments, firstly, as just a starting point, as well as insurance industry to researchers. But other than that, it's unfortunately it's a very, very complex problem, and without participatory modelling stuff, stakeholder engagement workshops and things like this, it's a difficult place to start. So that's just sort of my perspective, and it doesn't obviously give any solutions whatsoever, but it's just sort of putting it out there. Last comment to you, Isabel.
Okay. For the impact-based forecast in France, at least, Météo France is really going into the direction of integrating the vulnerability in the forecast now, and but they closely now they start to closely work with civil security services to somehow see how to better. I mean, of course their responsibility is quite mixed, because I mean. They have to warn directly the people, but in the same time you have the civil security related to the prefectures, administrative areas, who also do an alert. So this is very much tied together, and so you need to figure out what is the limit for one and the beginning of the work of the other. But so that's why it's very, very important that they decide together and they see how they can really integrate those information, because the detailed information is coming from civil security, but in the same time also meteorological forecast also talk directly to the people who need to take decisions. I mean, everyone in front of a crisis needs to take decisions. So it's very difficult to target this problem, and there's responsibility related to this. So, but I think they take this direction at least to find a common solution, and to figure out how to do that. So, and I think many meteorological services are going this direction and try to find the good path for that.
That's great, Isabel. I think there's a lot of work to be done, and building these partnerships is certainly a big part of that. Sustaining them is another challenge, but we'll deal with that on another day. I want to thank everyone for participating in the audience from all around the world, and especially those who had to get up really early or stay up really late. I apologize if we didn't get to your question. Put them in the chat room. We'll follow up if we can. We can give you the contact information. It was on the first slide. This will be recorded, and you'll be able to review it at your leisure. And just to highlight now, I think you should be seeing my screen, and that's the next seminar is November 11th, and you can see the times there, but that will be followed by 2 more. And that will lead us into the bigger workshop, December 1st to 3rd, where we tackle those 3 primary high weather initiatives. If you're interested in joining the Impact, Vulnerability and Risk task team, please give me an email. We can chat. It's voluntary, obviously, so we take advantage of everyone's time. And as I said, there's lots of work to be done, and no lack of trying to work to transfer it and make it useful, the research that we do. So with that, I really want to thank Martin again at WMO for really helping us coordinate this session. He has a lot of patience, and I appreciate that. And I'm sure the next set of hosts will have the same feeling. And especially thank our speakers. So Isabel, Sarah, James, and Jeff, thank you so much for participating, and hopefully everyone can participate again in the workshop in early December.